Daros Nine's winter didn't fall so much as attack. Sleet came in sideways, grains of ice needling any patch of exposed skin, the wind shouldering at the scaffolds until the metal answered with low, uneasy songs. Foreman Ren Thalos had 3 crews stretched across the pit face and a thermal digger that refused to keep speed, its readouts jittering from the cold. He sent a curse at the sky, wiped the rime from his beard with a knuckle, and leaned into the control bar to coax one more clean pass out of the machine. The floodlights threw long, torn banners of light through the murk. Everything beyond them was distance and rumor. He was thinking about the heat he owed his men and the paperwork he owed no one when the storm cut itself in half and a child's voice came ragged through the gap. It wasn't a word at first, only panic given shape. A thin thread of sound that didn't make sense until it did. "My mom is dying from hypothermia, human. Please help her." The plea ricocheted off the gantry and fell into Ren's chest like a dropped tool. He saw her then, small and gray-skinned and already shivering hard, picking her way over the corrugations with bare feet, both hands clamped to a bundle of rags swaddling something larger that slid when she stumbled. The security drones overhead looked at everything except what mattered. The cold chewed logic into useless pieces. Ren killed the digger's feed, stepped clear of the housing, and moved before his brain could deliver all the reasons men like him were supposed to wait for permission. The wind tried to unmake him on the run. Ice slicked the deck plates. The sleet found the seam at his neck and stung its way down his spine. His breath came back in steam that the gale unspooled as soon as he made it. He tore at the toggles on his coat as he went and ripped the thing off 2 strides early, dropping to one knee beside the bundle just as the girl's thin arms finally gave up. The woman inside the rags was too light for her size, all angles and bad color, skin mottled with the flat pallor that isn't sleep and isn't peace. Ren got the coat around her in one practiced sweep and his hands under her shoulders, feeling the clothes crisp with frost and the terrible slack of muscles out of heat. "I've got her," he told the girl because it was the sentence the storm needed to hear, and when the girl tried to speak again and failed, he said it louder. The shelter was 200 meters of bad footing and worse weather away. He picked her up anyway, adjusting her weight to his forearms the way you seat a beam, head tucked into the crook of his elbow so the sleet would find him instead. The girl grabbed his sleeve with both hands and ran a half step behind, breath whistling, eyes never leaving her mother's face. The yard, which had no talent for mercy, threw its usual obstacles at them, an unsecured cable snaking across the path, a drift of slush hiding a broken grate, a gust that turned the world into a curtain of needles, and they moved through all of it as if the path had decided to remember its job. Ren shouldered the emergency door so hard the latch screamed and then thought better of arguing, staggered inside with the 2 of them in his weather, and kicked the plate behind him until metal met frame and the gale became a memory on the other side of it. Heat didn't so much greet them as sulk. The emergency corridor ran lukewarm at best on a good day, and this was not one. He laid the woman on the cot he hated for its hardness and snapped the emergency thermostats up with the same impatience he saved for men who lied on forms, then slapped the heel of his hand against the heat exchanger until it decided it was employed. The girl hovered at the edge of the cot in a posture half prayer, half guard, lips blue, shoulders quaking as the adrenaline that had carried her this far finally asked to sit. Ren dropped to a crouch so his eyes were level with hers. "You did the hardest part," he said, steady and flat, "the way you talk to explosives. I'm going to do the next part. Stay with me." He peeled back the rags and found the truth he had expected and hated. Ice burn along the knuckles, fingertips gone the wrong white, hair matted to her skull with frost and sweat, the slow, shallow breathing that tells you a body has decided to spend its energy on staying and nothing else. He pressed 2 fingers to the carotid and counted low. The pulse was there, thin and treacherous, but there. He wrapped the foreman's coat tighter, trapping what heat the woman still owned, then rolled his own thermal liner out on top of that and cocooned her tight, leaving space at the throat for air and at the face for words if they came back. "What's your name?" he asked the girl as he moved. "Miri," she managed, and the sound broke on the syllable. I'm Ren, he said. We're not losing her here. The shelter had never looked so small. Ren made it into a machine by force of will, throwing levers until it remembered purpose, stacking heat where it would do the most good, stealing electricity from tasks that could wait and feeding it into the vents until the fans stopped whining and started breathing. He popped the panel on a maintenance locker, tore open a case of emergency coils, and clipped 2 into the trunk line so the air at least would have the decency to arrive warm. The portable plasma stove was supposed to be for thawing hydraulic lines and morale. Tonight, it was a hearth. He thumbed it alive, cupped his hands around the first lick of blue flame, and held them a heartbeat longer than necessary, just to show the room what success looked like. Neri, I'm going to warm her from the core out, he said as he dug in his kit and found the heat gel sachets that smelled faintly of citrus and antiseptic. No rubbing. We don't want to knock ice crystals loose in places that don't forgive. The girl nodded like a soldier receiving orders, then leaned close to her mother's ear and whispered a word that wasn't Terran and sounded like a door being asked to open politely. Ren slit a sachet with a thumbnail and spread the gel in patient lines along the woman's sternum and under her arms, the places where blood is closest to the person that owns it. He massaged heat back into the big muscle groups with the kind of care men assume he only keeps for metal, a slow persuasion, not an argument, letting his own hands be the bridge between the room and her. The monitors on the wall, meant for counting work hours and air quality, became, under speed and profanity, a poor man's telemetry. He clipped a sensor to the woman's earlobe and watched the number in the corner begin the long walk up from something that made his teeth hurt. Come on, he said, not to her, but to the stubbornness he had already felt beneath the skin, that thread of no that keeps people with unfair odds alive. He took a thermal blanket from the locker, shook it hard so its silver belly snapped open, and made a tent of it over her and the stove's small heat, careful to leave a channel for air. The shelter's lights found the blanket and bounced back warmer than before. The air lost its bite and gained a kind of faithful weight. Her breathing, which had been the ghost of a thing, lengthened by a fraction. Ren didn't trust fractions. He wanted monoliths. He traded his liner for a second blanket and tucked it around her like he'd been doing this every day of his life. Can she drink? Neri asked, voice small and fierce, and Ren weighed the question with the same seriousness he gave to structural loads. If she's swallowing on her own, he said. He slid an arm under the woman's shoulders, felt the heat he built cling for a second before the room tried to take it back, and lifted her just enough to test. Easy, he added, to both of them, and touched a warmed spoon to her lower lip. The first attempt went nowhere. The second found a swallow that was more reflex than decision. The third landed and stayed. Neri made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, then swallowed it down because she was not done being useful. She was singing earlier, the girl said quickly, as if afraid the detail would expire. Before the storm got loud, a small song so I wouldn't hear her teeth. Ren nodded without taking his eyes off the woman's face. When she sings again, we'll argue about whether it was in tune. He set the spoon down between tries and pressed the backs of his fingers to the woman's cheek. The skin under the chill was less stone than before, less borrowed. Color had begun to creep back into places that had given up. The stove's flames stuttered as the shelter's feed changed. Ren tapped the regulator valve with the gentlest reprimand and turned it a degree, the way you tell a dog that knows better to act like it. He checked the earlobe number again and liked it better. The pulse under his fingertips had found a rhythm that, while unimpressive by any musician's standards, was at least willing to be counted. He took a breath, slow, and let his shoulders descend the half-inch they'd been pretending not to hold. You did right coming here, he told Neri without looking up. You did right by her, and I'm not in the habit of wasting good work. The woman shivered, once a whole-body ripple that turned the blankets into a small landscape and made the gel packets twitch like startled fish. Ren held her through it, one palm on her sternum to keep the heat where it needed to live, the other bracing her shoulder so the movement didn't spend her. When it passed, she coughed twice, caught the third on the way up, and opened her mouth for air like someone who has decided the next hour is worth buying. Her eyelids fluttered without strategy, the way engines do when they're not ready to run but are insulted by idleness. Neri was already there, leaning in with both hands at her mother's temples, whispering the not-Terran word again, and the woman's mouth softened on the ends of the breaths as if the sound had found a place to sit. The room settled into a new shape around them. The sleet on the other side of the door kept up its argument with the planet, indignant and relentless, but in here the air learned a different task and performed it without complaint. Ren topped off the stove, swapped the spent gel for a fresh one, and smiled at nothing when the earlobe number took another small step in the right direction. "We're going to keep her warm and bored," he said. "Bored is victory." Neri nodded like a partner. The woman on the cot, wrapped in human blankets and a stranger's promise, took a thin breath that sounded less like survival and more like a choice. The number on the makeshift monitor climbed with the stubborn patience of a mountain goat, and then the woman on the cot proved she was not statistics by dragging in a breath that sounded like a door unsticking. Ren steadied her shoulder with one hand and kept the other spread across her sternum to trap the heat where the body spends it wisely. Neri hovered inches away, whispering syllables that made the air behave. The next breath arrived less clumsy, the next found a rhythm, and when Ren touched the warmed spoon to her lip again, the swallow that followed was a decision rather than a reflex. "Easy," he said, and the word worked its way down her throat as if it had been designed for this room. Color returned to her skin in cautious territories, at the ears first, then the mouth, then the knuckles, and the trembling shifted from the brutal shudder of failing systems to the ordinary shiver of a body remembering how to be inhabited. She tried a sentence in her own language and failed, tried another in something closer to trade and managed, "Is the cold done with us? Not outside?" Ren answered, "But it can't find you in here," and Neri sagged with a sound that exposed how long she had been bracing. He worked with the efficiency of someone who makes a living convincing metal not to forget itself, rotating gel packs before they cooled to rudeness, tightening blanket edges so warm air couldn't escape just because habit told it to, tuning the stove 2 degrees richer so the flame stopped thinking about quitting. When the woman's eyelids fought their way open, he tilted the lantern so the light was more mercy than interrogation. Silver-gray irises fixed on him, slid to Neri, and softened the way stone does when it finally remembers rain. "Sephra," Neri breathed, testing the sound like a new hinge, and then stronger. "Mama, it's me." The woman's mouth bent into something that wanted to be a smile before it considered how much that would cost, and she lifted a hand without making it a plea so that Neri could fit her fingers in around the heat. "Foreman," Sephra managed, the title the best she could do for a thank you, and he nodded as if she had addressed him with every honor guard the planet could afford. He did not ask for the whole story because bodies asked the first questions, but Sephra, greedier for truth than most convalescents, insisted on paying with context. The caravan had cut across the flats on a superstition that storms spare the fast. A wheel hub had sheared. The escort had decided the math favored the majority, and the minority had been her and her child with too little fuel and too much sky. Ren listened with the face he used for maps and broken cranes, marked the places where apologies don't help, and inserted only the pieces that change outcomes. How long since exposure? How far they had run? Whether Sephra could feel her toes. "They'll be foolish for a while," he told Neri, meaning the toes. And Neri nodded, meaning the world. He wrapped a spare thermal around the girl's shoulders as if deputizing her, and tugged a beanie down over the ears that had gone impressive shades of blue. She endured the indignity with the dignity of a sergeant. The shelter's wireless hissed like old soda. Ren lifted the handset, bounced a narrow beam ping off Crane 3's repeater, and angled the dish by feel until he found the tower's listening ear through the storm's tantrum. Static argued, a voice he knew as Sala from the boiler house shouldered through. "Say it quick, Ren." He gave her the essentials and no theater. Hypothermia, adult female, pediatric stable, shelter B17, power draw about to make accounting cry. And took her answer like a contract. Med sled grounded for weather, Sala said. "But I'll route juice from the annealer line and light your whole block if I have to. Keep her core warm, fight the afterdrop, don't let the system think it's clever." He flicked the switch that allowed the shelter to flirt shamelessly with the grid, watched the room grow a degree kinder, and acknowledged that owing Sala a case of whatever she drank when the world didn't end was a small price for being allowed to keep it. Sephra drifted in and out, doing the work only she could do. Each time she surfaced, she found Nairi and then Ren with the look of a person interviewing reality to see whether it had learned its manners. He talked them through the next 30 minutes as if preparing a crew for a complicated lift, because instructions are warmth when the mind wants to run. "Shivering is good now," he said. "We're letting it happen. If it gets violent again, tell me. No hot drinks yet, lukewarm and slow." He told Nairi where to put her hands, one on the blanket edge, one on her mother's hair, because touch convinces bodies to stay, and Nairi did it like prayer without the performance. The stove hummed, the vent gave up its sulking and began to behave like a partner, and the sensor's number stepped across another small threshold, into a range where Ren's jaw could unclench without permission. When words finally arrived that weren't made of necessity, Sephra used them to apologize, which is what tired people do when survival takes up more room than they think they are allowed. Ren cut the sentence off with a palm lifted like a stop sign and a head tilt that made apology look like a foolish way to spend breath. "You brought her to the only door in this storm that opens," he said. "Our rules cover the rest." Nairi blinked at the phrase, "our rules," like it had handed her a blanket with her name on it. Sephra's hand found Ren's wrist with surprising strength, her fingers cool through his callus and squeezed once as if sealing a bargain she intended to keep. "I will try to be easy," she said, and he snorted, because anyone worth saving is rarely easy, and the room already knew it. The shelter's warmth had begun to feel earned when the ceiling light over the door hiccuped and went from honest white to the jaundiced amber that means the perimeter thinks it sees something it can't name. Storms trigger false alerts all the time. This one carried a different vowel. Ren's hand went to the panel by reflex, checking the feed Sala had thrown them, checking the breaker that always wanted to wander, checking the line he'd stolen power from that would get him scolded later. The numbers were fine, the problem was outside. A dull thump ran along the deck plates like a warning sent by the floor, and then a second, closer, not so much a knock as a statement. "Company." Nairi sat up straight, nerves ratcheting the way cables do, and Sephra's gaze sharpened with the old practiced assessment of a person who has too often been the smallest thing in a room that arrived hungry. "Stay under," Ren said, and his voice made obedience sound like safety rather than surrender. He turned down the stove without killing it, and slid a folded thermal between Sephra's blankets and the cot to keep contact warm. Then he stepped to the door and opened the viewing slot with the same casual speed he uses for checking a tension gauge about to lie. The storm had softened enough to let him see silhouettes. Two corporate security drones, the size of washing machines, hovering under angry halos, and behind them a vehicle with more armor than manners, doors open to show three figures in slick storm coats. The left drone scanned the shelter sign as if weighing whether letters counted. The right found the lock and sniffed at it with a probe that sounded like greed. "Unauthorized heat draw detected," a speaker declared in a voice that had been designed by someone who believed intentions should be polite. "Present credentials for inspection." Ren put his face to the slot at an angle that showed cheekbone and not eyes, because microphones steal less confidence when they can't see where you keep it. "Foreman Thalos, Daros 9 extraction, labor jurisdiction 7, he said. "B-17 is an emergency shelter. Inspection tomorrow, audit next week. Today it's a furnace and a prayer." The nearest stormcoat leaned in just far enough for Ren to catch the gleam of a personal emitter tucked into a glove, the kind men who don't like to be told no keep for convincing doors. "We have orders to reclaim unauthorized personnel," the man said, and Ren felt the sentence feel around the edges of their tiny world like cold fingers under a blanket. "You have orders to read the sign," Ren said, and kept his tone friendly, the way welds are friendly until you pull on the wrong part. The probe touched metal and popped a little arc that salted the hinge with sparks. Inside, SciFi flinched in a way that told Ren habit still had teeth. He flipped the manual bar on the door, the one no emitter speaks to, and then reached up and pulled the safety ripcord that vented a puff of overpressure steam along the jamb. Legal, loud, and very discouraging. Outside, the drone backed off like a cat discovering a bathtub. You can either wait out the weather and try morning, he continued, or you can test how well your hardware likes condensation inside its feelings. The stormcoat took a step back, the way egos do when they aren't certain where the ground went. This will be noted, he said, which is what people claim when usefulness has left and dignity refuses to carpool. The amber light over the door stayed sullen, but the probing stopped. Ren let the panel fall shut and turned back to find Neri sitting on her heels, both hands flat on the blanket where her mother's ribs rose and fell, counting along with a silver-eyed intensity that made science look like faith. SciFi studied his face without asking for the report. He gave it anyway. "Drones and coats," he said. "They don't get to be a story tonight." The warmth in the room had dipped during the standoff. He stoked it back, rotated the gel packs, reclipped the ear sensor, and felt for the ugly drop that can follow an argument. The pulse under his fingers stayed steady, stubborn little engine, and he allowed himself a breath that reached the bottom of his lungs. Then the shelter reminded him it had opinions. The main line's breaker tripped with the sulky certainty of hardware that remembers it was designed by a committee, and the lights went from working to memory. Ren had already moved before darkness could pretend to be power. He kicked the stove into a conservative burn, snapped a chem lantern to life with a blood-bright flare, and slapped the breaker cabinet open. "Talk to me," he told the panel, and the panel, insulted by his tone, confessed in flickers. Overdraw on the annealer feed, stormback scatter, a fault downline that Sala would be swearing at right now. He rerouted around the fault like a man taking a detour through a neighborhood he trusted and jammed a shim into the breaker's petulant hinge to keep it from telling the same story twice. "Neri, you're doing exactly right," he said without turning, because he could feel the girl's steady hands through the room. "If she gets cold in the hands or feet again, tell me. If she says she's suddenly tired, tell me louder. If she tries to sit up, we negotiate." The girl's answer was a murmured version of his own cadence. SciFi's was a smile that didn't need the light to register. The breaker, properly bribed, stayed in, and the shelter recovered its better manners. Heat back to faithful, fan back to useful, the flame back to listening. Outside, the drones drifted off the way men do when they discover their schedule doesn't include heroism. The vehicle's doors thunked closed with the promise of paperwork done spitefully later. Ren went to the door twice more, not because he liked the view, but because he had learned that prevention is a job, not a wish. When the worst of the weather had bullied itself into another time zone, SciFi found his wrist again, not for permission, for conversation. "Anchor," she said, the word shaped as if it had been the first tool her people ever named. And then, halting but accurate, "Ren." He coughed out a laugh that hadn't been in his chest an hour ago, and squeezed back, careful of the blanket line. "Keep choosing to breathe," he said, not because she needed the instruction, but because he needed to say something the room would keep. Neri, who had not let her mother's pulse get away with anything for 10 full minutes, finally allowed herself to sit against the cot leg and blink like a child instead of a saint. The ceiling light, honest again, hummed its small, useful song. Somewhere in the boiler house, Sala's extra juice kept its promise. And in a shelter that had demanded everything from a foreman and a girl and a woman who remembered how to be lived in, the warm air did the quietest, bravest thing a room can do. It stayed. Warmth did the stubborn work and then, as if remembering it was weather too, tried to leave. SciFi's shivering climbed from useful to punishing. Her jaw clicked, breath snagging in little saw-teeth bursts that made the ear sensor number twitch in ways Ren didn't like. "Afterdrop," he said to the room, to himself, to any gods that respected accurate nouns and shifted tactics, less stove, more blankets, heat closer to core, hands steady and heavier so the body wouldn't panic at its own return. Neri matched him without being asked, counting breaths against the quiver, 2 fingers featherlight at her mother's temple to remind the skin it belonged to a face that would not be erased. When fear tried to sprint, Ren corralled it into steps. The pulse stuttered, tried an unruly rhythm, remembered the metronome of a life with appointments, and found something like order. "Stay with me." He told the number, and it obeyed as if mathematics had decided to be polite. Outside, the storm's tantrum quit on dignity and shifted to malice. The amber over the door went white again, and then, without asking anyone's permission, dark. The breaker had not tripped, the world had. Ren's head lifted a fraction, the way men do when the deck under them has just remembered a story it meant to finish. He set another blanket, slung the welder over his shoulder because habit loves redundancy, clipped a line into the eye bolt by the door, and looked at Neri. 90 seconds, he said. "If I'm longer, you pull the red cord and Sala will light the sky." Neri nodded with the solemn bravery of children who have already paid too much. Sephra found his sleeve, squeezed once, let go like an officer who trusts the man she's sending. The door shoved back at him with a cold that had learned his name. The safety line thrummed like a note a big instrument plays when it's pretending not to care. He ducked past the overhang and into a world made of knives, 2 corporate drones drifting down like self-important hail, and a splice on the feeder line, glittering with sabotage. "Of course," he told the wind, "because talking kept your hands from hurrying." He locked his boots into the anti-slip plates he'd bolted into the deck last summer for exactly a night like this, flipped the manual isolator, stripped the splice, and pushed new cable ends home until the connectors seated with a small, honest click. The drones nosed in, curious predators, and he gave them a length of steam from the purge valve that made them rise like startled gulls. Back inside, he leaned on the door until the latch remembered how to behave and put his heat and weight back where they belonged. The room had cooled 2 degrees, that felt like a betrayal. He paid the debt fast, stove richer, vent truer, gel rotated. 92 seconds, Neri reported, very calm and very accurate. Sephra's mouth shaped a smile that cost less than the last one had. Then the shelter spoke again, not with lights but with a noise no one wants. The kind you hear when the wrong hands insist on becoming part of your story. A cutter's whine skated along the outside hinge, and a voice pitched for a microphone said, "Open, Foreman. The penalty for unauthorized harboring is less severe than for obstruction." Ren did not argue law with weather or men who bring their own wind. He yanked the lever that vents overpressure into the hinge pocket. A dragon breath of steam roared into the cutter's mouth, and the whine quit in a shower of bad decisions. They tried the window next because cowards respect rectangles. Ren had already bolted that from the first night he'd taken a drunk down at closing time. "You are building a reputation," Sephra murmured, voice like paper just signed. "I prefer invoices," he said, and took one more trip to the breaker cabinet to teach the panel a new route around trouble. The drones drifted off, bored, insulted, or promoted elsewhere, leaving the shelter to do the holy work of holding a temperature steady. Sephra's shivering softened into the small tremor of engines idling in good repair. The color at her mouth decided to stay. Neri's eyelids finally betrayed her and closed in long blinks that failed to finish. Ren shifted the chair with one boot so she could slide into sleep against his knee without waking up appalled at her own body for wanting it. The earlobe number crossed the line he'd been aiming at since the door first slammed behind them, and he allowed the unwatched part of his mind to be tired. Toward morning, somewhere between the hour when men break promises and the hour when they fix what can be fixed, Sephra surfaced and stayed. She said his name without making it a question. She said her own as if reacquainting the room with good inventory. She said Neri's like testimony. "Still here," Ren answered, and the phrase filled the warm place under the blanket with more heat than the stove could boast. The storm, perhaps bored with being dramatic for no audience, slid its weight off Daros Nine's shoulders and went to find hills to bully. The amber over the door returned to white and then a very modest green. Ren stood, and bones he hadn't asked an opinion from in a decade offered one anyway. He ignored them and turned the stove down to the dignity of a simmer. "You kept breath," he told Sephra, which is praise, and she closed her eyes as if the commendation had been pinned to a uniform she would never have to wear again. Sala arrived not on a wave of trumpets, but in a med sled with orange chevrons and a dent she swore she hadn't noticed yesterday, skidding sideways into the lee of the shelter like a friend late to a party that hadn't allowed invitations. 2 medics spilled out in 2 thin coats, Cave with the good hands and Drin with the eyebrows that made all bad news sound negotiable, and the 3 of them turned the corridor into a clinic in less time than it takes a roomer to get dressed. Wren gave the report the way a foreman gives a manifest: onset, exposure, gel, warm air, afterdrop, electricity that had behaved under protest. Cave's nod was its own medal. Heated O2, warmed saline, a whisper of something to ask the heart to keep time. Sephra accepted all of it with the regal patience of a person who had planned to keep living and resented the delay. Neri woke halfway through and latched on to Wren's sleeve. She did not cry, because pride was a religion she had been raised in, but her shoulders admitted to being 7. The security vehicle returned at the exact wrong moment with the exact wrong swagger, and discovered the sled bristled with more authority than armor. Sala stepped into the open with her clipboard like a weapon and read the chapter and verse of Darosnine's emergency statutes for anyone whose ears had survived the night. Labor Jurisdiction 7, she concluded. Sanctuary of heat. You knock again and I bill you for the steam. The drones chose not to learn public shame and drifted higher. The stormcoats made faces at their own reflection in the sled's glossy side panels and left to go practice menacing weather that would flatter them. Drin clicked a seal, Cave snugged a final wrap into place, and Sephra's numbers shrugged themselves into a range mortality respects. You did good work, Cave told Wren, which is how professionals say thank you, without tripping over it. They offered transport. Sephra shook her head with an authority her pulse supported and said, not far, and meant not away. The sled stayed long enough to leave a field kit and a scrawled note that translated into, call me if the grid forgets its religion, then bumped off to see who else the night had tried to collect. Sala lingered under the overhang, rubbing steam out of her hair with a rag that had seen more honest grease than most men see in a lifetime. You owe me 2 fuses and a case of the good coffee, she said. Done, Wren said, and meant it with the econometrics of gratitude, which always pays above market. By noon, the sky had remembered color, and the pit face had the nerve to look like work again. The crews drifted by in 1s and 2s pretending to be checking lines. Each left something that wasn't payment because money would have been an insult. A pair of insulated socks, a packet of candied ginger someone's grandmother swore would bully a stomach into behaving, a child's drawing of a square shelter with a heroic blue stove. Wren strung a line across the corridor to dry what had been soaked and hung his coat beside Sephra's thawed rags. Neri, who now trusted chairs to keep promises, sat on the edge of the cot and informed her mother that boring had won and would continue to rule. Boring is victory, Sephra agreed, stealing the line with the right to use it. Wren turned down the stove another whisper and was surprised to find amusement in the space where vigilance had been living rent-free. They ventured outside in brief, edited increments. The snow had become a suggestion rather than a law. The wind had learned what courtesy looks like. The sun did a half-hearted impression of warmth that fooled no one and made everyone generous. Neri stood on the spillway in her new socks and announced that the world had been loud and could try again later. Sephra leaned against the doorframe and let the light sketch her scars into a story that did not require footnotes. Anchor, she said again, but this time it was a title, not a crutch. Wren shrugged as if accepting a promotion he intended to perform with the same outfit he'd worn yesterday. When the day folded, they went back inside because even victories get tired. He set the kettle on the stove because rituals persuade rooms. She adjusted the blanket, not because she needed it, but because comfort deserved rehearsal. Neri climbed into the chair by the vent and fell asleep mid-sentence, with the unembarrassed trust of a child who has decided the night owes her nothing. You answered my prayer, she had told him earlier, more matter-of-fact than reverent, and he had told her the truth. You hauled it here on your feet, I just opened the door. Sephra's hand found his wrist again, the grip no longer a plea but an agreement, and stayed there without apology. A minute later, as the heater clicked from brave to steady, Ren heard the sound Nairi had promised him. The tiniest thread of song, off-key, soft as steam. Sephra humming, not for fear but for habit, the kind that keeps a room warm because someone bothered to learn the tune.